always tight for startups. We will quickly introducing myself for those who don't know me yet. I'm from Berlin, studied international business there in this corporate study program that is, I guess, specific to Germany. I then became a product manager for medical devices for neurosurgical implants and was global product manager at B. Braun. So yeah, one of the biggest German medtech companies. And then I moved to Switzerland and did my MBA in St. Gallen. This is also where Max and I met. He was in the part-time class at this time when we graduated 2018. I was in the full-time program. And afterwards I gained some startup experience, not the classical way for an MBA, but I found a startup in Zurich that was doing something very similar to something that I had in mind as well of doing, so I thought it would be cool to join them. I lived in multiple countries as well, would describe myself as a networker and an outdoor person and definitely like adventurous. Max, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you so much, Vincent. So, a warm welcome from my side. I'm Austrian actually, so as Vincent already said, we have met during the MBA program at the University of St. Gallen. So, I'm an attorney at law in Austria and also here in Switzerland. So, we have newly founded our XR Legal AG, so 4 months ago. We do focus quite a lot on competition law, regulation law, compliance, governance, data protection, and tech. So besides, I do have, I'm a farm owner in Austria still, so where we grow vegetables, so it's an organic vegetable farm. And via this farm, I came into the clean tech industry, which is, and gained startup experience there. And besides having XR, we do have Integral Consulting, which is a leadership and strategy consulting company also here located in Zurich. So, and in our law firm, as we have lawyers from Germany and Austria, we do lots of cross-border cases and also active in the finance markets, where we do support startups.
Great. Thank you, Max. Always a pleasure to be doing things with you, and thanks a lot for your support in general.
Thank you for inviting me, Vincent.
Yeah, sure. So let's come to the agenda. I will give a quick introduction about what Service for Equity is, or S4E in short, so that we have the same understanding. Then Max and I will highlight some options how service providers can support startups. We try to give an objective overview basically of the possibilities, and then I will dive a little bit into how we do it at KAPSLY and what we would recommend as well for service providers, what things to consider when approaching such a partnership. And at the end, I hope we'll have enough time, but I think so for a Q&A. Also, please feel free always to ask questions in between. If there's anything either that you don't understand, that wasn't clear from our slides and in our words, then please feel free just to speak up, interrupt us, or if you have any other questions, things that maybe you had experienced in your personal work with startups or in general, it would be great to also hear a little bit of your experience and your stories and to really make this interactive. Okay, so what is Service for Equity? In general, basically in return for providing certain services that you provide to a client or a startup in this case, you receive company shares instead of cash for this value of services. It's basically that simple. You can also call it service investing. The term sweat equity is used relatively often. That refers most often also to individuals or co-founders who who work in the startup, and instead of receiving a salary, they receive equity. But the concept is basically very similar. So why is service for equity relevant at all? We all know that startups, especially at early stages, have limited resources. They need professional support, usually beyond advisors and mentorship, which you get at accelerators. Once you have this, you figured out what you really want to do. You need professional support quite often to really bring a great solution to the market. Basically, and this is where we believe service providers can have a great impact on those startups and really prepare them for success. And we have seen that relatively often startups approach agencies and ask, hey, can we work or can we offer you some equity? We don't have so much money. And there are also many service providers who are interested in this, but we also realize that relatively often those deals are not done very well. I think one of the challenges is that what is I think quite natural, that you want to define how much equity you receive for your services right away, and you want to fix that percentage. Often the challenge is that it's not as easy as investing money, because the relationship between the service provider and the startup is much more important, and you need to figure out whether this collaboration works very well, because only in that case your services really also provide value to the startups. And this is where we've seen often where it can lead to some kind of conflicts at a later point, and then those deals sometimes don't work out as you were hoping it in the beginning. And also then there's sometimes this question whether the service providers are just exploiting this situation and just want to take equity. And on the other hand, you could say, if you give up your claims on cash and commit to equity right away, the question is also, is that the fair compensation really, if you have no securities basically in that sense. So there's also something that has to be weighed, and those are things that we considered when looking at the different possibilities and figure out what we think is a good alternative or a good solution. So basically, to tell you what we do at KAPSLY is basically we're building a service investment marketplace where we are connecting startups, usually quite early stage startups. Mostly they have raised just from friends and family and are just preparing for a real funding round. But it also could be startups who want to stay bootstrapped and self-funded. For them, a different solution is more interesting that we'll come to later again. We connect them to service agencies. So we took the decision that we do not work with private people and freelancers. That also has some tax consequences. I think Max will maybe talk a little bit about this later on. Because we believe that service agencies really have the capacity and the strength to basically prepare the startups for success. And at that point, that also becomes interesting to investors, which is like a second stage of the KAPSLY development or our vision, maybe to create a VC fund that can also finance those startups, and especially where we see that where we have very strong service providers who are also very strong startups, where we see how they developed over the time. I'll have to check I just saw there was a comment, I'll have to check them later, or maybe Katharina, you can have a look at those as well, have an eye on this while you're still here, if that's something connected to our points here or to the slides.
I think it was...
Yeah. No, go ahead, Max.
I think the comment which popped up was, it's bad that you're not working together with freelancers, private persons, it's just with service providers or agencies.
Okay. I mean, it's still probably interesting what we will show for freelancers as well. Just for the KAPSLY marketplace right now, our focus is on service agencies. And I think, you will probably understand a little bit more why this is later on when we come to the different options. Okay. So yeah, we will get into the options now, actually. So the first one is not really where you're investing your services, but a supplier credit can already be quite beneficial to startups. So basically, you allow the clients to pay later. So it's not a real investment. I mean, you could put an interest rate on this, or reduce the sconto that you would otherwise maybe provide in case you do that. It could be interesting if you have long-term partnerships. It's especially, I think, relatively established in manufacturing or fast-moving consumer goods, where you allow the clients basically to sell your goods before they have to pay you. So that's then especially interesting for the cash flow of the client and helps them to build up their business, and at the end brings you more business as well when they can grow. So there's still more people coming in. Sorry if I'm sometimes interrupting a bit. So this is a relatively simple agreement. I think there's no lawyer required. Sorry, Max, but maybe you have a different opinion on this. Yeah, I don't know. Do you have any words on this?
Yes. So you're absolutely right, Vincent. This is a simple agreement between the service provider and the startup, as you already mentioned. If the startup has to pay the bill or the invoice later, it saves cash for the startup, which it can then use for other things. Nevertheless, and this is a bit the legal view, and I know lawyers are sometimes a bit complicated. Lots of people think they overdo stuff. Here, you do not really have to have a contract, but nevertheless, it would be helpful to have at least some emails where it is clearly stated, or the terms. So like saying, we're going to postpone the payment for 6 months, and then the service provider says, yes, this is fine for me. It's all about, so when working together with a startup, and Vincent already mentioned it in his introduction, it's kind of a relationship. It's a relationship built on trust. And what we do see as lawyers quite often is, like in a marriage or in a relationship with a girlfriend, someone there might be the time when the trust is not given anymore, and this is exactly when we start when the service provider or the startups have rumbles. So therefore, just having an exchange of emails where you have stated some bullet points is sufficient, because always think of the worst case, that you have to file a lawsuit. You need to have something to prove your position.
Okay, thanks a lot for providing that perspective. You will have more interesting comments, I think, and for the next options also, where it's more relevant, also the legal perspective probably beyond this.
Yeah.
So the second option could be revenue shares, or basically revenue-based financing, maybe you know that term, which is also, I think, becoming more popular in Europe. This is especially interesting also for bootstrapped startups, because in a bootstrap startup, if they don't plan to make an exit, you probably don't want to have company shares, because they'll not increase in the value, or you will not be able to measure that value very easily. So here the concept is that based on the future revenues, you will get a certain percentage that you will define with them. Usually there's a cap, so that you, for example, do not get more than 2x, so the double amount of the service value that you have invested, basically, or like a maximum duration, for example. In that case, you do need a solid revenue forecast, ideally, to really get a good estimate whether this will be beneficial to you and how much the startup can actually pay. It would be good to know the gross margin of the startup, so that they can also afford to pay this off their revenue. And so yeah, it's especially interesting if you have a direct impact on the sales of the startup. It's also relatively common in IP licensing.
I think it's his laptop.
Oh,
tell him to turn off the camera. He's back.
I'm back. I
Yeah,
can't
you can
see.
turn off your camera so it's a bit faster.
You
Okay.
were frozen, Vincent.
Sorry for that. It's always in the evenings, I think, that my internet gets worse. um, do you still see the slides?
Like,
Yes.
Do you still see the slides?
yeah, it's all
Okay,
good.
perfect.
Thanks.
Yes, and for outsourced production, that could be interesting as well, where basically you pay a certain value on the unit, basically. Okay. Here we go to the next slide. So I'll hand over to Max, who can explain this from a legal perspective, especially.
Yeah. So I think so. What Winston and I have done to prepare this webinar. So we were thinking about a couple of cases we walk you through. Maybe so it might be a bit easier for you to get a feeling about what we are talking. So the first case is imagine there's the ATEC AG. It's a medical startup located here in Zurich. And the ATEC AG deals with novel diagnostic techniques to detect and prevent strokes at an early stage. And then you have a service provider. It's called the BMAT AG, which is an established pharmaceutical company and sees ATEC AG as a potential future major because they maybe have had the estimation, it's a fast-growing startup, and we do exactly produce the supplies they might need in the future, and therefore BMAT AG has a huge interest in the ATEC AG or in the startup to help and wants them help them to grow fast, and therefore BMAT AG agrees to provide medical equipment, and in return ATEC AG promises to pay with future revenues. So what are the legal implications here? So first of all, you need to have an agreement which creates legal certainty. This is a bit related to the point I've mentioned before. At this stage, I would say it's necessary to have an agreement in place to make sure that, or to avoid future legal quarrels, also to upkeep the relationship between the BMAT or the service provider and the startup. I think Vincent had it really good in his introduction. So what kind or the amount you will get back from the revenues then is stipulated in the contract. This is the most important thing. So you have the parties to the contract. The parties to the contract are the service provider and the startup. They conclude this contract, and in the contract then you stipulate exactly, and what is stipulated in the contract is actually the outcome of the negotiations you had up front. So you're free to negotiate whatever you want. If ATEC says, okay, 30% of the revenues we generate within the first 2 years, the first years. So here you're really free to stipulate in the contract whatever you want, which makes economically sense for both companies. So I would say the borderline here is you're talking about fairness. Every time when you're talking about a relationship between a startup or a service provider, we are talking about fairness. I think it was also mentioned on one of the first slides we have seen today. It's all about not exploiting the situation of the startup upfront. I think this is the most important hint I can give you to uphold a healthy relationship for the future and to continue business in the future.
Great. Thanks, Max. You mentioned the trust component is very important. I'm wondering, as a service provider, you probably worry, will they actually report this revenue correctly and pay the right amount? maybe they are performing much better than you expected, and now they fear they have to pay more if the cap hasn't been defined. What are the claims that the service provider can make due, and how could they do that?
First of all, even if you're a startup, there are certain requirements regarding bookkeeping. They are stated in law. There are certain standards depending on the size of your company, depending on which jurisdictions you are. So first of all, we have the legal requirements, which clearly state what you have to keep in mind when doing the bookkeeping. As a service provider, then in the agreement we have, which we have here on the slide, you have the right to have a look into the financials of the startup. This is something that can be stipulated in the contract. If everything goes wrong, then you can still file lawsuits. But I would never ever work, and I think this is the most important thing, together with a startup where I do not know the founders really well, where I haven't been talking to them for several times, because it's trust-based. So what I can do as a lawyer, I can minimize the risk. Or, for example, if we figure out at a later stage they do not pay, or the startup does not pay with the revenues, or if we figure out at a later stage they reported incorrectly, then we can file a lawsuit, and the basis for the lawsuit then is the agreement we have concluded up front. But I would say here it's really important to be reactive, so proactive, not reactive. So therefore, first of all, meet the founders of the startup, talk to them, listen to them, meet them several times, and then make sure that you have a valid and well-formulated contract with all the points which are necessary, like when do I have the right to access the financials? What can I do to, where do I see it? You can even set up own reporting requirements or stipulate own reporting requirements in the contract just to be on the safe side.
Okay, cool. Thanks a lot for sharing that. Then let's move on to the third option, I think it is, out of 5 we've prepared, by the way, so you have some estimate how much more is coming. Stocks, I think everyone knows what stocks are. So basically, as a service provider, you really become a shareholder of this company with all rights and obligations and potentially tasks as well. This is interesting if you really believe in the startup, if they plan an exit and you want to participate in this and really be or play an active role in this startup. And they also come in different flavors, so I listed some alternatives here as well. Those could be stock options, where you would only execute them maybe where you see already an exit or something is coming, and then can turn and sell those right away potentially. It could be contributions in kind. So this is basically where you do not invest your money, right? You provide your services, they have a certain value, and they will be converted into equity of the company, so that the startups don't have to pay those services. Those liabilities will be converted to equity right away. To value those contributions, usually you need an auditor of some sort. Or at least they need to approve this, and in that case, when you have your service values, it's relatively simple probably. And another alternative is the stock purchase, where that I've also seen of some service providers doing it, where you really invest money and the startups can basically then use this money to pay you back. And so everything is relatively straightforward, transparent, let's say, correct also probably in a traditional way. But that means you really need to have the money to basically have enough resources to kind of like pay for your own services on top of just not receiving money. So basically financing your services upfront somehow. So this to give you a quick introduction to what this implies actually. It's probably something that you would think on top of your head when you think of service for equity, but this solution is actually not so simple, and I think Max can maybe explain this in a little bit more depth, or have some more points on this.
Yeah, so for a company, in this case, when we're talking about stocks, we are talking about an AG already. So it could be also a limited liability, a company with limited liability, a GmbH, which is pretty common here in the DACH region. So what's the difference? It's about the equity you have to put in the company at the beginning. So for an AG, it's 100,000 Swiss francs. For GmbH, it's 20,000 Swiss francs. Well, it doesn't change that much. So when you have an AG, what do you get? You get shares. If you have a GmbH, you get a share in the GmbH. Well, it's a bit complicated because there are lots of things you have to keep in mind. So if you on GmbH and you want to issue shares, or you want to bring in new stakeholders into the company, like what we are doing here, then you need to have, first of all, a shareholder resolution, or at the GmbH, or a resolution from the general meeting. The next step then is you need to have, then you need to go to the notary, and then you only can start issuing new shares or bring in new stakeholders into the GmbH. So we have set it up here with the case we had before, slightly modified. So in this case, the ATEC AG uses a new type of software, and BMAT AG, which is an established software company, in this case now promised to help to develop the software with its own resources. So we have just said, okay, the BMAT AG provides services which are worth Swiss francs 120,000, and in return we get stocks for 120,000 Swiss francs. So now here we have some implications, like if you talk about the BMAT AG, they conclude so there's a service agreement between the service provider and the startup, and what do you have there? So you just say the payments, so of the services the BMAT AG has provided is made in shares. Now you always have to keep in mind the tax perspective as well. So here BMAT AG then would invoice 120,000 Swiss francs to the ATEC AG. So what does it mean? Plus the value-added tax here in Switzerland, currently 7.7%. So it would be 100,000 Swiss francs plus 7.7% value-added tax. This means you would then get, or BMAT AG would then get Swiss shares for 120,000 plus 7.7, what is paid by the value-added tax, or what you have to pay as a value-added tax. And then BMAT AG would immediately have to pay this value-added tax, which has been invoiced to ATEC AG, to the tax office here in Bern in Switzerland. So what does it mean then on the balance sheet? So BMAT AG then has, when the shares are issued at a certain time, will then have to have the shares in its balance sheets. And now it's getting a bit tricky, because it also has to pay income taxes for the shares provided to ATEC AG, because for BMAT AG, this is income. This is income. So on an AG level, currently you have to pay taxes of 22%. So this means you have to pay the 7.7% value-added tax. Then you have to pay income tax on the AG level of 22% for the 120,000. And at the later stage, if BMAT AG has the shares in its balance sheet and then decides to sell them maybe 5 years later, and the shares are now not 120,000 Swiss francs worth anymore, but because they increased in value, maybe they are now 240, so they have doubled in price, so now they are 240,000 Swiss francs worth. This means, in this case, the difference between the 120,000 Swiss francs initially and the new valuation has to be taxed again. So what can you do then so what do you then stipulate in the contract? I would say in this case, the fairest thing would be not to get stocks for 120,000 Swiss francs, but for 120,000 Swiss francs plus 7.7% for the value added tax and plus 22% for the income tax, because then as BMAT AG, as a service provider, you have reached break even.
Cool, I hope everyone could follow this. It's relatively
So don't
complex.
worry if you have
I think it was a great explanation, Max. It was really awesome to make this transparent. It's just a complex topic. But I think you...
question. Yeah, so in case if you have questions regarding this, let me know so we can discuss it yet.
Karina has raised her hand.
Yeah, I have one question.
Yeah, of course.
If I can jump in here. Thanks for sharing the example. Now, my question is if the BAG provides a service of 120,000 and then the shares have a higher value, does the company also have to pay taxes on the increase? Or is that only then the case once the shares are...
So this is always a bit of a tricky question. So this differs between Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. So I'm talking now from the perspective of Switzerland. Now let's say because as BMAT AG or the BAG, let's shorten it a bit, once you invoice the services, this means you have an immediate income, although there is no money inflow into BAG, okay? This means you have, and this then directly goes into the financial statements, and then you have to pay at the end of the year 22% on it. But then you have it in your balance sheet. What does it mean having it in your balance sheet? It's just then it's there's a provision. So once you realize it, so when is the realization? Now thinking as a tax lawyer, when do you realize the new valuation of the shares? It's then again when you sell it. Okay, because then it's the market saying, okay, the worth. So in value, the shares have increased by 100%, and then you have to pay taxes again. Otherwise, you can see it like the position is sleeping in the balance sheet. As long as it is sleeping, no worries, tax-wise.
So you
okay,
would...
so then it's like a nicht realisierter Gewinn.
Genau, es
yeah,
ist einfach,
okay.
wir kennen das nämlich aus diesem Buch. Sorry for switching.
No, you can talk German. I just
Okay,
didn't know the word for that term.
It's really like so it's pretty much the same. Then you have a company, and their company owns 4 or 5 apartments here in Zurich. So when you sell them, then you have cash inflow again.
Okay, thank you.
That's the realization. This is the realization.
Okay, thanks for your question, Karina. We can maybe also dive into the Q&A later on and elaborate some of the topics more. I'd say for now we'll move on with the next slides, and then so the fourth option then is the convertible loan. basically a convertible loan that you integrate in a service agreement. Basically, there you convert only at a later stage, so you do not commit to equity right away, but you kind of provide a loan or a certain budget that the service that your client doesn't have to pay right away. So it gives you a little bit more time to get to know each other. There's a fallback door potentially if it doesn't work out, where the startup, the client, then still owes you the money if you don't have a mandatory conversion, which you shouldn't have. And you can also, or should probably, define a valuation cap and a discount at the beginning of the collaboration. So a valuation cap basically means that there's a maximum valuation. Usually you convert this convertible loan at a fundraising round. At this fundraising round, I'm making an example, the startup has a value of 5 million, or it raises at the valuation of 5 million. But in your loan, in the contract, you agreed on a valuation cap of 3 million maximum. So then your services, the 120,000, for example, will convert at 3 million and not 5 million, so you will get more shares, right? So this is a benefit for you, so that you don't, have this disadvantage and then have some kind of a benefit because you invested a little bit earlier. And the same goes with the discount. The discount would be applied to the company valuation, and then usually you pick the one which is more favorable to you. In some cases also an interest rate is applied. The interest rate is basically applied to the value of your services, so then the 120,000 would increase over time and this higher value would be converted. This is basically how that works. And so I'll hand over to Max again.
Yeah, so here we have a case, a short case again, so the case you already know. So different to the other two cases we had before is the amount of the services of 120,000 Swiss francs is now structured as a convertible loan. So what you have to keep in mind, actually it's not so complicated, it's just a bit of paperwork what you have to do. So first of all, you need to have a shareholder resolution again, or resolution from the general meeting, depending whether you are structured as an AG or whether you are on a GmbH. And then you need to have this convertible loan agreement. And I said before, you said, Vincent, you do not want to see the conversion obligation. Did I get you right, or?
Yeah, right. It depends, because then you have a higher risk. You don't know if the collaboration works out so well.
Yeah. You're absolutely right, but sorry for hitting this. Point. It's a bit like. Maybe the shareholder resolution or the resolution from the general meeting. Here you need to have so here you have to go to the notary, and now you have a tax, or now you have an implication which is really important for the startup. As a startup, if you have, so having a look at the balance sheet, what do you get? You get now now you get money inflow into your company, and it's still a loan legally, from a legal perspective. It's a loan. So where do you have loan on the balance sheet? It's under liabilities. And here, so when seeing Austria, Germany, or Switzerland, so for Switzerland it would be, for example, Article 725 of the Swiss Civil Code. Here it can happen that you suddenly face indebtedness because liabilities are much higher as the equity. This is something you have to keep in mind. And so, as Vincent just said, is there's the risk that the relationship doesn't work out. For the startup, by the way, it's much easier to have a convertible loan with the conversion obligation, because then you say at a certain point the liabilities will be converted into equity, and there you do not have the danger of bankruptcy. And keep in mind, once you have a company, so an AG or a GmbH, and you're the CEO, there are certain legal requirements you have to keep in mind if there is indebtedness. Because also it's although the AG or the GmbH are companies with limited liability. So what does limited liability mean? You as a person, so maybe you as a person own a house, you own a car, and you have shares of 60-70% in the AG. If you have paid in for equity, means you have 60,000, 70,000, which is actually a sum set aside for potential creditors. And now, if you miss the deadline to declare bankruptcy, when the liabilities are much higher than equity, then you might face bankruptcy. And if you do not declare bankruptcy in time, if you miss the time period mentioned in the law, then in this case, creditors can use all the money you have set aside, and which is also outside the company. So therefore, for the startup, having this conversion obligation might make sense, because when you have a conversion obligation in this convertible loan agreement, then it is still liability on the balance sheet, but you have this small addition. It's with the conversion obligation, so it doesn't count as liability. This is maybe something you should keep in mind. So as you can see, it really depends. What Vincent said would absolutely make sense for B-made AG, but it might be counter-beneficial for our startup for this certain reason.
On the slide there, you said it's kind of free of form, but it also depends on the form whether you need a notarial certification. Does that depend on what you just explained, whether it has a mandatory conversion or not, or what are the implications?
The notarial certification. So the convertible loans, for example, take Germany as a market. And I think really good contract templates have been issued by the German Standards Setting Institute. And in Germany, it's still not clear. It's a bit a gray area whether you need to have a notary or approval from a notary or not. Therefore, I would highly recommend to have it, although it has not been decided by the Supreme Court yet, because it's pretty unique. So convertible loans are still unique in Germany. What could be the consequence if you have concluded or entered into this convertible loan agreement without having the approval from a notary? It could then be invalid. So here in Switzerland, for example, you do not have to go to the notary when you're an AG, but you have to go to the notary when you're a GmbH. Because why? The shares of a company, if you would like to issue new shares, they are just registered in the share register. So as a rule of thumb, when you need here in Switzerland the proof from a notary, every time something is issued in the not the share register, but the commercial register. And when you have a GmbH, then all the stakeholders of the GmbH are registered in the commercial register. And maybe there's something you can keep in mind as a rule of thumb. It's more complicated for GmbH than for an AG.
Okay. So it's more likely with the GmbH that you need this notarial certification as well.
Because everything, you can see, so having a startup, I do know it's a bit of trade-off, because founding an AG requires quite a lot of money. But later on, it's much easier. So probably it makes sense having a GmbH first, and then afterwards reform the GmbH into an AG, because when you're an AG, you are freer what you can do with it.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot for explaining this. So the last option we have, how you can support startup, is virtual shares, or also called phantom stocks. It is actually relatively established to incentivize employees in startups in the whole DACH region. Those phantom stocks are relatively common because it's easy to set them up. In this case, basically, the recipient of those virtual shares is not a real shareholder, but the startup actually owes them the equivalent value and a certain number of shares that is defined based when this contract is closed. So it's basically just a bilateral contract between the startup and the service provider. However, the quality of those agreements then also depends very much when you can claim the money, etc. And Max, maybe you can explain this a little bit more. What are the things here that have to be considered when working with virtual shares actually, and maybe also what are the benefits and why is it so popular among employee incentives, and that could be also applied to service providers then, of course.
Absolutely, Vincent. So I'm actually a fan of virtual shares because it's less complicated than the other options we had before. And here, so you also have an agreement between the company and the startup. So as you already said, the owner of the virtual shares, and now I'm talking about the service provider, they do not become a shareholder in the company. So virtual shares are a partial replica of a share of a real shareholding in a company. So I would like to emphasize the word you do profit in accordance with the terms stipulated in the contract, but you have no voting rights like shareholders in the company itself. So it's also from a tax perspective, I think it's quite favorable. So you can benefit quite a lot if you're an employee. Usually, so you have a new fast-growing startup and that wants to attract really high potential people to grow even faster, or they have a really new product which they want to introduce into the market. So promising them by some employee incentives, promising them to get virtual, retain and attract new talents. If you're a service provider, you just have the virtual shares, and in a case exits, whatever, you then can realize what is stipulated in this agreement between the service provider, between you as a service provider and the startup. So you have the entitlement to cash on occurrence of certain conditions, and you do not become a shareholder, so you have no participating rights in the company. I would say it's quite easy, it's fair, and it's easy to set up. So you can easily have this agreement created around the virtual shares. You can negotiate with as a service provider with a startup, as a startup with a service provider, and you have a contract, a legally binding contract, and I would say you avoid a lot of the paperwork you need to do when having in comparison to the options we had before.
Okay, thanks a lot. Are there any questions on the different options? Is there an overview here in case you don't remember what we had in the beginning? So there was the supplier credit, which is relatively little risk but also offers little reward. The shared revenue model, convertible loan, virtual share stocks, they're all very similar from a risk-reward perspective, so that's why they're here. Stocks are definitely the most difficult to set up, then probably followed by convertible loans and virtual shares are relatively easy since it's just a bilateral agreement. It has to be worked out well, it makes sense to use professional templates and probably or consult a lawyer. Yeah. Okay. So let's come to how we are doing this at KAPSLY, but also what we recommend. So here's a quick overview. I hope it's not doesn't look too complex. So basically, the startups come to us. They apply for a project. We will see if they're a good fit. So they should be at a certain stage, like they should have incorporated the company, should have validated their business model assumptions and gotten some feedback from first clients. And if they have this, we kind of give them like some service credits, or basically say, okay, up to the value of 10,000 francs, you can use those credits to work with service providers, and then obviously it depends on the service provider how much they are willing to invest, how much they can afford. And this 10,000 is basically a number that we made up, but it's based on the experience, and we kind of wanted to limit the exposure and the risk as well in the first step. This value can always be increased if you as a service provider want to invest more, of course. So then we basically help with the matchmaking and provide the service contracts, and then it goes over to actually the collaboration over time. And in this service contract, we put that after 6 months, you and the startup should decide what happens to those 10,000 francs or whatever the amount is that was not compensated with cash until this moment. And then the startup has the option to basically pay this back. So it's kind of like a supplier credit, you could say, if they want to choose this option. And there are two alternatives, either revenue shares or company shares. So revenue shares are more interesting for bootstrap startups, as I said initially. So that should be decided upfront. If the startup doesn't plan to do a fundraising round or doesn't plan an exit, as I said, company shares are less attractive. And especially if you help them with setting up the sales organization or supporting them in sales activities, that could be a nice, kind of like a commission as well. And after 6 months, it can be converted into company shares. I'll define this more specifically what we mean with company shares, because we recommend using virtual shares and not the real stocks, for those reasons that Max has basically explained in the last couple of minutes. And so this is in case you really have a strong partnership and a good relationship that was established over those 6 months. And we believe this is one of the main benefits of our solution, that you really have defined those rules, get to know each other, and only later on really commit to equity, and not on the first date, right? So how do you start? Before you even start working with the service provider, with the startup, you should do some kind of a due diligence. So you should really also talk to the team, get to know them, understand their business model. Is this something that you understand, that you buy into? Ask them a couple of questions, or also challenge them a bit. This can even be beneficial to the startup as well in some cases, because often you as a service provider are much more experienced in those fields. You've also maybe worked with multiple other startups before. And so having those conversations is very important to both sides, right? And you should also put on your investor hat, kind of, and analyze the business model, the financial plan a little bit as well, see what's the cash situation, and consider those things. So you really want to you don't want to fall in love with the team and the project, but it only makes sense to move on if you do, if this is something you really want to work on. And then in the next step, once you have this kind of foundation, obviously you should go more in depth with the project, plan ahead, what are the milestones, and what is really the expectation, what should be the outcome of this collaboration, what should really be the benefit to the startup to make them successful. yeah, and basically discuss the compensation terms. So think about what is your hourly rate, how much of that do you need in cash, how much can you invest, what is the total amount of the investment project that you can invest. And those are basically the points, the most important points that will go into this service agreement that we're providing. Besides the normal parts of the estimation of the total project costs, we should also define an investment budget, which could be this 10,000 francs, those service credits that we have assigned to the startup before, which then can be increased later. Define the hourly rate, define the milestones or in the iteration cycles that you want to work on in case more iterations are needed, that you can also invoice additional hours, for example. And one important part here is really you have to separate between the shared revenue part or the virtual share part. As I said, that really depends on the type of the startup it is, and in those cases you define the valuation cap, the discount, or the percentage of the revenue, and those are all parts also where we can help with in those kind of negotiations. We also help those startups to prepare, to kind of get ready. That could be through workshops or something that we can also offer to the startups. So the service agreement basically has the benefit that it defines the rules for the collaboration, but you still remain flexible, at least within the 6 months time window, which should be enough time to get to know your client very well and then make a good decision how to move forward. Then during the collaboration, I think this is relatively obvious, but I just wanted to mention it as well. You really want to build trust, you want to create transparency and use collaboration tools or tracking tools. Ideally, we're also offering things like this. We define in the service agreements that you should work in sprints, so we kind of like force you to work together with them or the startup to be proactive as well, to check the work regularly, so that you get continuous feedback and are always in communication and exchange, basically. And then when the point comes after those 6 months, you basically decide together with the startup what should happen. So in this case, I have a little bit different example what Max had before. So here the total project cost would be 30,000 euros. You say, or you have agreed that 20,000 will be paid in cash, 10,000 is invested potentially. So those 20,000 are paid by the startup, either based on the milestones or monthly, that's defined in the contract. Basically this is paid to you as a service provider, and only once you have money you will pay 10% to KAPSLY. And then after 6 months you decide whether you, or the startup, whether they pay you back with cash or you decide to convert this into virtual shares. In this example, the startup has a share price of 100, so the startup would owe you the value equal of 100 shares. So the value per share should increase over time, and you're flexible in defining when this payout should happen. I mean, the last incident is basically the exit, right? Then the startup cashes in and should pay you out. But it could also be a Series B round where the startup raises a lot of money and basically they want to pay you out, maybe because otherwise you also get a lot more expensive to the startup. For you, maybe the benefit is that you get the cash a little bit earlier, don't have to wait the whole 5 years or even longer, potentially how long it takes. And basically they pay you out this equivalent then when this event happens that you have defined in the virtual share contract that we will basically set up with you. So here is basically the same thing in written text. So yeah, you can also invoice the services in that case and convert them to virtual shares. I believe that the startup should keep the option to pay with cash, just because you never really know what's happening in the future and in the collaboration, and potentially do not continue working together, and then it's also in your interest. I will turn off my camera again in case the connection was bad. Yes, and then that's basically it. The share after those 6 months, the shared revenues become due as well in case you went for this option. So basically, then you take the relationship to the next level. Yeah, and this is it. So in summary, we want to help you to take away the legal pain of those kind of collaborations and provide really professional contract templates, also for normal service agreements can be. But we want to make sure that you really have great projects that you work on, that you are kind of excited to work with them, that they're good matches. We also want to help you a bit to think like an investor and define those budgets by guiding you through this process. And I believe something that was not so well established yet for service providers is this revenue-based financing approach and the virtual company shares, because there are really just many benefits to those options. So that's it from my side. Are there any questions